when we look at the history of Christianity in China, we must remember that China, since the late 19th century, it was actually the largest, mission field for many American Christian organizations and also for, many European organizations as well.
Hi, I'm Heidi, a historian and host of They Also Serve, where we discover the lives of little-known women who made a big impact on Christianity in America and around the world. Lottie Moon, a 19th century Baptist missionary to China, wrote to her foreign missionary board, "What we need in China is more workers. The harvest is very great, the laborers oh so few. Why does the Southern Baptist Church lag behind in this great work? Our Presbyterian brothers are putting us to shame. I think your idea is correct, that a young man should ask himself not if it's his duty to go, but if he may dare stay at home. The command is so plain, go." Her foreign mission board, although slow, gradually did respond to her pleas. At the turn of the century, European and American missionary organizations poured financial and personnel resources into China. The story of Christianity in China did not start in the 19th century. In fact, what Lottie and her fellow missionaries didn't often realize was that Christianity first arrived in China before it did in many of their own countries. Christianity has ancient roots in China, before the United States was a country, before Europeans knew the Americas even existed, before the Vikings had converted to Christianity. The first Christians had arrived in China. After all, Christianity began in Asia.
Well, initially I was actually interested in indigenous history of Christianity in North America. So I was already doing lots of research, and I was interested in doing more research among the Lakota Christians. And I was reading one time while being a PhD student, and all of a sudden I just discovered so much writing from the Jesuit. From the 16th century and 17th century, I was really impressed about their work in China.
This is Susangeline Patrick. She's an associate professor of world Christianity at Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri.
I'm also a faculty member at NATES, an Indigenous Learning Community,
formerly known as the Native American Institute for Indigenous Theological Seminary. She is the author of a book on 16th to 18th century Christianity in China, as well as a book on Christianity in Shanghai.
I remember the first time I went to visit Shanghai, I actually stumbled into this historical park, and it was the memorial park of Xu Guangqi. So Xu Guangqi was actually a 16th century, 17th century Chinese Christian, dubbed as one of the three pillars in Chinese Christianity. I was really surprised by all of that. And after many years of, trying to find my research topics, I landed on Chinese Christianity and felt very happy to actually discover more about women's stories.
Xu Guangqi was a Chinese polymath, an astronomer, a mathematician, a Confucian scholar, a government official, and an author of a treatise on agriculture. His early childhood did not bode so well. Shortly before he was born, his family suffered a series of financial losses, compounded by pirate raids. In his 20s, wind and rain ruined the crops around Shanghai. A drought followed by flooding the next year caused widespread starvation and suffering for agricultural families like his. But it also drove his interest in new agricultural methods and a curiosity about European technology. He first met Matteo Ricci, a Jesuit missionary to China in Nanjing. Together, they translated a number of works from Latin to Chinese and works from Chinese to Latin. Due to their friendship, Xu Guangqi converted to Christianity. But Christianity in China predated Ricci's 16th century mission.
When I was reading Christian history, I discovered that, at least in reading Chinese Christian history, I didn't initially see a lot of women's stories. that piqued my interest. I was very curious. What did the women do? When I was living in western part of China, really the backbone of the church was the women in the early 2000s. So that was an interesting question, and I wanted to learn more. I was really just curious.
Only a little bit is known about women from the earliest period of Christianity in China.
Christianity started in China officially from 635 AD. This is a period of time that it was the Great Tang Dynasty, and Tang Dynasty in Chinese history was very much open-minded. They had lots of visitors and also diplomats from lots of different places. There is a network of trades called the Silk Road. So the Silk Road had been connecting China, Central Asia, and also part of Europe since maybe even the second or the first centuries before Christ. There were some Syriac Christian missionaries. They actually went to visit the capital city of Tang Dynasty and officially presented the Bible and also some Christian paintings. They were received by the Prime Minister Fang Xuanling at that time. It was quite an audience and a meeting. So that was actually the beginning of Syriac branch of Christianity in China. And it was documented by this stone stela. It's called the Xi'an or the Daqin stela.
Christianity came through official missionaries to the Tang Dynasty, who along with Christian traders traveled the Silk Road.
I think it all started from the Silk Road, a series of trading route or transportation network that actually cut across Central Asia, and it actually spread into China.
This is Joseph Lee. He's a professor of history at Pace University, an executive director of the Global Asia Institute. He's the author and editor of numerous books on Chinese history. We'll hear more from him in our next episode.
The early form of Christianity, like the Syrian-speaking or the Syriac-speaking Estonian church, they followed this trading network to make their way from the western part of Asia through Central Asia and then eventually into China. During the Tang Dynasty, they also established a very significant institutional presence in the Chinese capital called Chang'an, which is today's, Xi'an. They also left behind many archaeological evidence, including a very famous stone steles that actually capture their extensive spread, within the Tang Empire. From there, they also try to, engage in the translation project. I think they translate many of the sacred texts of Syrian language into classical Chinese. They also borrow many Buddhist terminology to talk about the concepts of Trinity. So it is kind of fascinating to see some of these archaeological sources and also literary sources that actually left behind. And it actually helped historians now to reconstruct the early encounter between Christianity and also pre-modern China.
The Duhuang Caves are today a World Heritage Site. They contain Buddhist art from the 4th to the 13th century. In 1900, a Taoist monk discovered a sealed-off cave, now called Library Cave. In the cave were thousands of manuscripts. Most of the manuscripts were Buddhist, but they also contained Christian and Jewish texts. Christian women from the Sogdian people, an ancient Iranian civilization that lived in Central Asia, intermarried with Chinese men. But in 845 AD, Emperor Wuzong banned religions viewed as foreign, including Buddhism and Christianity, and decreed that their assets be seized. Over the ensuing years, Christianity declined in China in the face of persecution. Christianity remained a vibrant religion, though, for the people who inhabited the area along the Silk Road. Genghis Khan, the driving force behind the Mongol Empire, never became a Christian himself. But his sons married Christian princesses from other clans. Probably his most famous daughter-in-law was Sorgatani Beki. Like most Mongol queens, she wielded considerable power and ruled territory in her own right. Two of her sons became the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Her second son, Kublai Khan, conquered China and established Yuan dynasty. Her third son ruled the Ilkhanate dynasty, which controlled what is now Iran, Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Contemporary chroniclers regarded her with deep respect. A Persian historian called her
the most intelligent woman in the world.
A Syriac scholar said of her,
if I were to see among the race of women another woman like this, I should say that the race of women was far superior to that of men.
Another grandson of Genghis Khan married a Byzantine princess. The Mongol Empire, which included China, during Kublai Khan's rule, practiced religious tolerance, and there were many Christians in the court. But the religion practiced by Mongol Christians was Nestorian. Catholics who viewed Nestorians as heretics never had a large number of converts in China during the Yuan dynasty. In the 14th century, the Yuan dynasty collapsed and most remaining Mongol rulers adopted Islam, not Christianity. Christianity again declined in China. In the 16th century, Jesuit missionaries made another attempt to evangelize China.
I think China, and also to a lesser extent, Korea and Japan were always on the Jesuits' minds because they were the first ones to conduct this modern sense of cross-cultural mission. So Francis Xavier had arrived in Japan and missioned there for a couple of years, and then in his conversation with the Japanese Christians, some of them presented this question and said, do the Chinese know about Christ? So the Japanese at that time said, well, if the Chinese didn't know about Christ, then how should we know that what you presented to us is really advanced? Because at that time, Japanese culture really regarded the Chinese culture very highly. As a result, Francis Xavier was motivated to go to China, and he actually landed in Shangchuan Island off the east coast of China with a Chinese Christian and some other Jesuits at that time. But unfortunately, he died after a couple of months being there. But that was the beginning that lots of Jesuits were already thinking about how do we share the gospel with people in the Ming Dynasty in China.
Matteo Ricci is probably the best known today of the Jesuit missionaries to China. He mastered Chinese. Eventually, he was invited to meet the emperor in the Forbidden City. During his time in China in the imperial court, he made several high-profile converts. One of them was Xu Guangqi, who first piqued Susangeline's interest in Christianity in China.
There's actually some overlap between Christian art and also women's contribution in Chinese Christianity. For example, Candida Xu was a 17th century Chinese Christian woman, and she was actually the granddaughter of Xu Guangqi. And I was very delighted to really find out that lots of the Christian women were very much involved with being patrons of the arts, the architecture, church decorations. They were very much involved with producing lots of the Christian art.
The Jesuits found their traditional methods of evangelism didn't always work. They needed to adapt and embrace the local culture if they wanted to be successful. According to one Jesuit missionary,
Chinese girls and women have so little to do with the world that one almost never sees them. It is this which makes the conversion of women and their instruction in this part of the world so difficult.
They found the women did go to Buddhist temples and talk to Buddhist monks. But most Buddhist monks were considered at the time low class in China. So this restricted missionaries' evangelistic efforts to other classes, which restricted their ability to evangelize women. Nonetheless, some Chinese women eventually did become Christian, either learning about Christianity from male relative converts or listening while Jesuit missionaries spoke to male relatives and the woman sat behind a barrier so that she wasn't seen. Eventually, Chinese women converts evangelized other women.
So in my research, I found out that at least in the 16th century and 17th century in China, there were some restrictions of women's role in society. So lots of times their primary roles were actually restricted within the homes. But they did have lots of influences. They exercised authority to teach and educate their children and also to manage the household as well. So it was not surprising that the Chinese Christian women really played a role in evangelism within their network of families and also other high-ranking Christian women. And then at the same time, I was also really surprised. For example, Candida Xu and Agnes Yang, these Christian women in the 17th century, they did lots of charity work. They opened orphanages and they were very much aware of the communities they lived in. For example, people who were elderly, they needed care, and lots of Christian women did charity work. I think that was probably the similarities with European Christian women's experience. At the same time, in my research, I found out their involvement with their churches. So in the 17th century, there is segregated churches. So there were churches for Chinese Christian men. There were also churches for Chinese Christian women. I think that was a different phenomenon in Chinese Christianity in the 17th century. And also the lack of missionaries and also priests probably created this situation where women actually took on lots of the roles to conduct prayer meetings and to exercise their Christian faith, devotion, piety. So I think that's the area where they have taken on leadership.
The societal restrictions for upper-class women in Ming China allowed women space to create their own church experience. In places with enough Christians and money, separate women churches were built, and women served as leaders of these separate churches.
Well, Gayle King actually wrote a very excellent book based on the biography of Candida Xu. She was very much involved with the Jesuit mission. She was a 17th century Chinese Christian woman, and she was the granddaughter of Xu Guangqi. So Xu Guangqi at that time was almost like the Secretary of State. You know, if we think about our contemporary time, that was his high position, and he already became a Christian. So his granddaughter, Candida Xu, was this third generation Chinese Christian, and she was very much involved with supporting the Jesuit churches, and she employed her skills and organized other Christian women to actually sponsor the Jesuits to do their mission and also to build churches. She was also involved with other Catholic orders at that time as well. She did lots of charity works. Her story became known because of her confessor at that time. He was a Jesuit and his name was Philip Blay. He actually wrote a biography. He wanted to present Candida Xu's story to Europe and letting other European Christian women to hear about this apostle of China and a model for all Christian women.
Philip died in a storm off the coast of India on his way back from China, so he never had the opportunity to expand his book as he had originally intended. According to Philip, his book was
to allow women of Europe to get a slight idea of the abundant good deeds and great virtue of this lady.
But of course, other Chinese women were also involved in establishing how one lived out one's faith as a Chinese Christian.
One particular Chinese Christian woman was Agnes Yang, and she was the daughter of Yang Tingyun. She also lived in the 17th century as well. She organized this Catholic convent for women. So it's a little bit like a group of Catholic women who were dedicated to singleness and to practice devotion. Her father was also one of the three pillars of Chinese Christianity. So she was also a high-ranking class. She played a role in really introducing a type of spirituality which was quite new in Chinese Christianity, because the previous Syriac Christianity actually didn't have the kind of Christian singleness as a role in Christianity. And also the Syriac priests could marry. So it was a little bit different. And Agnes Young actually played a role in organizing such group in the 17th century.
The women that Agnes Young helped establish were known as the virgins. Like European nuns, they took vows of celibacy, but they didn't live in convents, but rather with their families. These women taught basic Christian doctrine to other women and children, performed baptisms, organized devotional activities, including prayers, and took care of the sick and dying. There was a cultural precedent. It was considered virtuous during the Ming Dynasty for widowed women to take vows of chastity and remain lifelong widows. The state gave chaste widows testimonials of merit, and some communities erected commemorative arches for them. So Agnes Young's Virgins was a melding of her Christian faith and her culture. Christianity made inroads into the highest levels of society towards the end of the Ming Dynasty.
Some of the palace maidens and also some of the eunuchs, some of them have become Christians. So there is a eunuch, his name is Wang. He was the one who actually convened the palace maidens and also other eunuchs to be able to celebrate the Eucharist and to gather as Christians. And so primarily there were also some correspondence as well, but the leadership fell on the eunuch Wang.
The 1640s was a period of famine and war throughout Europe and Asia. A series of failed harvests exasperated internal divisions and led some kingdoms and even empires to fall. This included the Ming Dynasty. The Manchus, a Northeast Asian people, conquered Beijing in 1644. The dynasty they established became known as the Qing Dynasty. After losing northern China, the remaining Ming emperor's family retreated south. The grandson of the emperor Wan Li, Young Li, emerged as the emperor of the southern Ming Dynasty, which lasted briefly after the fall of the north to the Qing.
Some of the Jesuits were actually imprisoned during that period of time, and some of them supported the late Ming Dynasty.
As the dynasty retreated south to Nanning, the Empress Dowager Wang and the consort of Young Li converted to Christianity. The Emperor Young Li himself was sympathetic to Christianity.
And they were known as Helena and Constantine because it was really the Jesuits' hope that perhaps they will promote Christianity. There were actually Christians in the Ming Dynasty court. So some Jesuits really split their allegiances. So one supported the Manchurian dynasty, the Manchus, to take over, to establish the Qing dynasty. And then there were some Jesuits actually remained with the late Ming dynasty rulers because they wanted to really support and because they became Christians. The empress mother actually wrote letters petitioning the Pope to send help and also to pray for her. That's a very interesting aspect of Christianity. I thought, wow, there's actually some correspondence between China and Europe in the mid-17th century.
The appeals to the Pope were sent too late, and the Pope was not in a position anyways to help an emperor so far away. In the early 18th century, the Catholic mission to China collapsed. This wasn't due to the Jesuit support of the Qing and the Ming, but rather it was in large part due to infighting between the Jesuits and the Franciscans, who felt Jesuit concessions to Chinese culture were heretical.
There is a 50-year gap, 1773 to 1850. So this is a period of time that the indigenous Christian women really played a role. They conducted prayer meetings, they organized, they evangelized, they did lots of charity works. I'm still trying to find a lot more evidence perhaps writings, what people have encountered. So lots of the writings I have encountered came actually after 1850. There are some letters petitioning some Catholic priests or Protestant missionaries to be sent to certain areas. So that's where we get the idea, these Chinese indigenous women actually had been playing important roles in leadership. And also the leadership struggle came after mid-19th century, because then the Catholic missionaries, they were a little bit different from the earlier 17th century Jesuit mission or other Catholic orders. Some of them requested the French sisters to come to China and to take over the indigenous women's work.
When Protestant missionaries arrived in China in the 19th century, they were encountering an ancient country with over 1,000 years of history with Christianity. Persecution had driven Christianity underground and slowed or stopped its spread. But where it remained, women had done much to help Christianity survive. Christian women in China had experienced teaching biblical doctrine, caring for the needy, evangelizing, and leading church services. Protestant missionaries had much to learn when they tried to proselytize China in the 19th century. Chinese women would end up shaping how Protestant missionaries did evangelism and what the Christian church looks like today. Their legacy lives on in the millions of Christians in China today. Join us as we continue the story of Christianity in China.
They Also Served is researched, written, and hosted by Heidi Olson Campbell. Thank you to our guests on today's episode, Dr. Susangeline Patrick and Dr. Joseph Lee. This episode was produced by Heidi Olson Campbell and Heather Moore. They Also Served is edited by Nina Vallado. Cover art and social media is by Chelsea Ernina. Stephen Husett is our equipment extraordinaire, and this show was executive produced by Adam Fenner. Thank you to the Adventist Learning Community for making They Also Served possible.